two papers in the published issue this October, but it's grouped together more or less on the basis of subject matter, and so that the professors could talk back and forth. And we have Professor Adler from Penn, Professor McGarity from Texas, and Professor Kysar from Cornell. So, it's welcome.
And thanks so much for putting together a really terrific conference. I apologize for not doing a PowerPoint. As it turns out, I'm fairly high-tech in my notions of what policy analysis should be, but pretty low-tech in my pedagogic and communicative techniques. But I did just draw up a little handout, and hopefully you all got one of those, which should give you some sense of where I'm going. I'll try to be pretty quick, because I do want to have time for us to have a conversation, because I think there is a lot of overlap, some disagreement perhaps, but certainly a lot of overlap. The title of the paper is Risk Analysis for Natural Hazards, some lessons from environmental risk analysis. That was the paper I sent around, and I realized I really should put cautionary in there. That is, the focus here is really on the cautionary lessons for natural hazards risk analysis that can be learned from the history of environmental risk analysis. Now, why do it that way? Risk analysis, in particular the risk assessment part of that, and I'll say in a little bit what exactly that means, but in any event, it's just true that there's a much better developed sort of general shared methodology for environmental risk assessment going back to this very important document, the Red Book, which was published in 1983, than is true for natural hazards risk assessment. And again, by environmental, it's actually a term of art. When people talk about environmental risk assessment, they're really focusing on health and safety, and in particular toxins. So the paradigmatic environmental risk in this sense is a toxic pollutant, maybe a toxic food additive, and radiation, as compared to the stuff we've been talking about, natural disasters or natural hazards, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, extreme heat, and others. So again, the project here is to look at fairly well-developed environmental risk assessment and analysis practices as practiced by, at the federal level, agencies like EPA, FDA, OSHA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and others, as well as state environmental agencies, and think about the cautionary lessons that we can learn. And again, I'm focusing here on sort of negative or cautionary lessons, not because there aren't positive lessons. There are many, many positive lessons, right? In general, I think probably more so than Tom, for example, I'm a big admirer of what's been achieved in the field of environmental risk assessment. But if we're going to sort of translate that over into natural hazards, a way to focus the inquiry is to focus on the practices not to be imitated. What are the ways in which perhaps natural hazards regulators should do things a little differently? Focus here is going to be on policy analysis rather than policy tools. By policy tools, I mean the particular measures by which agencies, federal or state, might reduce the impacts of natural hazards, and there are a variety of those, and there's a well-developed scholarly literature on that. So those would include things like levees, right, and other structural measures, flood walls. They'd include building codes, hurricane-resistant building codes or seismic building codes, widely used in California, for example. Might include zoning, right? So zoning floodplains or coastal areas to reduce the death and property impact of hurricanes and floods. Warning and evacuation plans, insurance, very important. Not just in terms of risk spreading, but also in terms of inducing people to take mitigation measures. Obviously, if insurance is experience rated, that'll tend to induce people to mitigate. So, but in any event, I mean, understand that there are a variety of, obviously we can't stop natural hazards, right? But there are a variety of policy tools that might be used to reduce their impact. My focus will not be those in particular, but rather policy analytic techniques. Right, policy analytic criteria. That is, the criteria or the tests that policymakers should use to choose among, right, the various policy tools. Things like cost-benefit analysis, one possible policy analytic test, equity analysis, safety maximization, technology-based criteria, and so forth. And I'll say a little more about those down the road. One reason, again, for my focusing on policy analysis rather than policy tools is here there is much more overlap with the environmental area. That is, the particular tools that EPA and FDA and OSHA use are very different from the tools that FEMA uses, right, or that the Army Corps uses, right? EPA and FDA and so forth, their tool typically is to use technology to reduce emissions, while the tools for natural hazards regulators are very different, as I've just discussed, but the policy analytic tests might well be the same. That is, both sets of agencies might well use cost-benefit analysis. So there, the focus is going to be on that. Just a bit more definitional stuff. So again, I mean the terms policy analysis, risk analysis, and risk management to be basically synonymous. That these are all a question of thinking about the decision procedures or tests or criteria for choosing among policy options. What's risk assessment? Risk assessment is used to mean a kind of input to policy choice. That is a characterization typically of the deaths and injuries or death and injuries risks which are associated with different pollutants or hazards. So it's not itself a policy analytic test, but a kind of informational input to a policy analysis. All right, so that's the just some initial conceptual stuff. And again, it seems to me that here as elsewhere, you can't really think about what the appropriate policy analytic criteria, governmental decision procedures are without adopting some kind of moral framework. Further, you know, there are people like John Rawls or Cass Sunstein who think that we can just have, we can sort of bracket, we can come to an overlapping consensus on moral issues, a set of criteria or considerations that any reasonable person will agree to. I think that's impossible, right? I think there's always going to be some controversy, but hopefully the framework which I'm putting out here, which I've defended elsewhere, is relatively uncontroversial. Weak welfarism, which is a framework that gives relevance to overall welfare, right? So overall social welfare, the sum of individual welfare, as it were, is one of the things which is normatively, morally important, but is not necessarily the only thing, right? So weak welfarism is not the same thing as utilitarianism. I also want to recognize the importance of equity considerations, recognize the importance or possible importance of moral rights in the sort of deontological sense, and even recognize the existence of intrinsic environmental values. That is the value of preserving species or ecosystems quite apart from human well-being. Now, most of what I'm going to say here, those don't come into play, at least directly, so I'm going to bracket those. But in terms of what the overall view is, namely weak welfarism, all these things are potentially part of the picture. So I'm certainly not, again, a utilitarian. Also, for purposes of this paper, I mean, elsewhere, I'm on record as defending cost-benefit analysis. I mean, I tend to think of cost-benefit as a sort of the best proxy or policy analytic criterion for implementing overall welfare. But nothing I'm going to say here is committed to that. Right? I don't want to tie this to my arguments elsewhere in defense of cost-benefit. A final thing I want to bracket, so I'm bracketing a lot, and obviously the risk always is, you know, if you try to be uncontroversial, everything you say is going to be trivial, right? So I'm trying on the one hand to be relatively uncontroversial, but say something which has some content to it. But I want to also bracket controversial institutional questions, which have to do with sort of the optimal specificity of the statutes that govern natural hazards agencies. How much authority should be delegated to these agencies? How much should they be reined in by the sorts of statutes we see often in the environmental area that EPA is often given very specific directives? This is a difficult question, right? This is the optimal specificity of statutes, optimal delegation is a difficult question. It's an empirical question. Two things come into play in that, which I touch on in the paper. One is decision costs, right? To the extent that you're delegating a power to an agency, you're asking the agency to make more discretionary, non-ministerial decisions. There are going to be costs to that. And even more importantly, monitoring costs, right? You may not trust the agency, right? You may think that the agency has its own nefarious aims, or maybe not so nefarious, or the agency may be sincere, but may be particularly susceptible to capture by interest groups and so forth. So all of that is very controversial, and I want to place that to one side. Notwithstanding that all this bracketing, I do think there are things that one can say that is cautionary lessons for natural hazards policy analysis and risk assessment that might be learned from environmental analysis and assessment. And just to summarize what those are, I'm not going to have time to go through all of these probably, but in any event, they're there. One set of lessons goes to policy analysis itself. That is the criteria or decision procedures that natural hazards regulators should use. And again, I should say, I mean, I've mentioned FEMA and the Army Corps at the federal level. Obviously, this would also be applicable to states, in particular the state of California, the state of Florida, localities perhaps. But in any event, lessons are, and then I'll spend some time going through these in greater detail. Policy analysis should be multidimensional at some level. Explain that in a second. Technology-based policy analysis should be grounded on multidimensional analysis at some level. Policy analysis should be sensitive to population size at some level. Do not conflate moral rights infringements, that is the content of these moral rights or deontological constraints, with welfare setbacks, even to vital aspects of welfare, even to vital interests. And then a set of lessons for risk assessment, namely this informational input to policy analysis, broaden risk assessment to include non-safety dimensions, incorporate social science, not just hard science, quantify hazard impacts, recognize individual variability, consider quantifying uncertainty through probability distributions, and eschew a general posture of conservatism in handling uncertainty. Okay, so let me go first through the lessons for natural hazards policy analysis. And rather than doing that lesson by lesson, what I'll do here is just talk about the main themes of that whole part of the paper, which generate the particular lessons. And again, I'm focusing here on cautionary lessons, just to focus the analysis. I mean, by dimensions, I mean the dimensions of well-being, right? The different ways in which people's welfare can be positively affected or negatively affected. Obviously, welfare itself, whatever your particular account of welfare is multidimensional, right? Welfare is obviously a matter to some extent of being alive, of having good physical health. It's also a matter of not suffering negative mental states, trauma, pain, of having a range of positive mental states, enjoyment, and so on. It's a matter of having a job, having meaningful goals in your life, of affiliation, and so forth, right? So I don't think anyone's going to quibble with that. It's also important to see, and again, this is something which is very clear and is a big theme in the recent scholarly literature on natural hazards, that natural hazards impact, right? The occurrence of a natural disaster has impacts on multiple dimensions of well-being. Obviously, death, people lose their lives or are injured. Obviously, property loss, but there are other sorts of impacts, which at least in principle, bracketing decision costs and monetary costs, we want to capture. Psychological trauma, there's actually quite a large literature looking to the trauma effects of natural hazards. Community disruption, unemployment, again, obviously an important impact. And we now know increasingly, I mean, it's always been intuitively clear, but we know increasingly this literature on happiness, which looks at the effect of unemployment, unhappiness. Unemployment is a bad thing to happen to someone. Unemployment has a major, and we can now quantify this, and have a lot of evidence of this, has a really major negative effect on one's flourishing, and loss of cultural heritage, a big issue with Katrina. The other thing I should say, parenthetically, is the degree of impact is heterogeneous across hazards. So, for example, interestingly, if you look at the graph of effect on life and health as opposed to property, the lives lost in hurricanes up until Katrina, right, were going way down. In part, given better prediction technology and evacuation technology, property loss has gone way up. In fact, the two may be related. It may be that people are building more in hurricane-prone areas because they know their life's not at risk. By contrast, what's a really in terms of life and limb, what's a really risky natural hazard? Tornadoes. Again, up until Katrina, tornadoes were the single highest natural hazard source of death and injury. Obviously, much less property damage. So there skews it's both true that natural hazards have these multidimensional impacts, and they're skewed. All right, I'll have to be a little less dispersive here. The crucial thing, I mean, this is true descriptively, but who cares? The crucial point, obviously, is that our underlying moral theory, the things that we care about, the normative considerations we at bottom care about, are also multidimensional. I mean, that's clearly true for overall welfare, right? I mean, overall welfare is not just a matter of maximizing safety, not just a matter of maximizing consumption, right? But depends on all the various things that contribute to human flourishing. It's also true, I want to suggest, for equity. And again, equity is a lot. What equity means is much more controversial. There's a much smaller literature on the content of equity as compared to cost-benefit and the content of overall welfare. But equity, too, I want to suggest, is sensitive to the various ways in which people's well-being can be advanced or retarded. And moral rights as well. And this, I think, is an important point, and a point which is often overlooked in the environmental literature. I mean, there one gets the sense sometimes that the only kind of moral right is the right to your physical integrity, right? The right to health and safety. I don't think any deontologist would admit to that, right? I mean, it's true that if you kill me or you punch me, right, you've invaded my moral rights. But it's also true that if you steal my car, you've invaded my moral rights, right? So it's moral rights too are going to be multidimensional. Or to put that, I mean, an example I use in the paper, which is a natural hazard type example. Imagine that government, not so hypothetical, right? Government negligently builds a levee, right? Fails to disclose that to nearby residents. Some of them are killed and others lose their houses. Well, in that kind of case, there are two sorts of rights violations. One would say there's a violation of the right to life on the part of the people who were killed, but government's also violated the rights to property on the part of those whose houses have been destroyed. So this is one, hopefully not too controversial, point about the basic criteria. It's also true, this is going to be a little more controversial, or at least a little less obvious, that these criteria are sensitive to the population size at risk or affected by the hazard. That is, if you can imagine doubling, right, or quadrupling the size of the population who's exposed to a pollutant, right, in the case of an environmental hazard, or who is proximate to some possible site of a hurricane, flood, or earthquake in the case of a natural hazard, that's going to affect, I want to say, how these different criteria play out. I mean, that's obviously true in the case of overall welfare. If you got more people who are going to be killed, or whose property is going to be damaged, or who are going to be psychologically traumatized or lose their jobs, that's a larger cost in terms of overall welfare. But the same is true, I want to submit, in terms of equity. And again, the full analysis would be very complicated. You need to sort of play out the different specifications of equity. The specification, which I think is most plausible, I've argued for this in a recent book, or chapter in a recent book, is that equity fundamentally is about ensuring, or at its core, most importantly, is about ensuring that people don't fall below thresholds of well-being, in particular don't fall below thresholds with respect to the different dimensions of well-being. So equity means ensuring to begin with that people are not seriously psychologically traumatized, that people don't suffer protracted unemployment or protracted homelessness, that they don't have their all their relationships disrupted and so forth. Obviously, that too is a multidimensional thing. It's not just a matter of ensuring that everyone lives a certain length of time. And rights too, and again, we can, let me go on here, but I want to argue that moral rights too are sensitive. That is, it makes a difference whether we have a single rights violation or multiple rights violations. Now, one might challenge that by saying that moral rights are absolute, right? Even one rights violation shouldn't occur, and so what does it matter whether we have one or 10 or 100? Bottom line is, I think, I mean, just to truncate a longer discussion, that's got to be wrong. I mean, it's got to be wrong, at least where the victims are not identified, right? I mean, no one thinks that government has an absolute moral obligation to stop all homicides, right? If you think anyone who thinks there's a moral right has got to think that that includes the right not to be killed, the right not to be wrongfully killed. Homicide would be the paradigm of that, and yet we do not take all possible measures to stop wrongful homicides. And so the moral reason, or the deontological reason the government's going to have to stop homicides or stop the wrongful infringements that occur as a part of natural hazards are going to be sensitive to the number of people whose rights are violated. All right, so this is a claim, I mean, this is just a claim, right, about the underlying criteria. One, that they're multidimensional. Two, that they're sensitive to population size. Now, here are the cautionary lessons to be learned. Number one, environmental agencies frequently use policy analytic criteria which are not multidimensional, right? Sometimes these criteria, that is their decision procedures for issuing regulations and so forth, focus on one aspect of welfare. Typically, it's going to be safety. So some classic examples are Section 109 of the Clean Air Act, right? Court just told us a couple years ago in the Whitman case that that really means, right, issue criteria for these major pollutants which maximize safety without reference to cost or anything else. Another example is the Delaney Clause, which bars any carcinogenic food additive regardless of the possible benefits. Indeed, its benefits in preventing other sorts of safety risks. More generally, the FDA's criterion for licensing food additives says license them only if they're safe, right? Consider their safety, don't consider their nutritive benefits, for example, or their hedonic benefits. And I should say, I mean, a lot of this stuff is mandated by Congress. So I'm not trying to rag on the EPA as opposed to Congress. And for that matter, as I'll say in a second, I'm not even necessarily trying to rag on the tests, but it's important to observe that the tests are either safety focused or, so in that sense, unidimensional, or sometimes they don't focus on the aspects of welfare at all. That is, they're technology based. And again, these sorts of tests are widely used in the environmental area. Current Section 112 of the Clean Air Act, which focuses on carcinogenic air pollutants, basically says that EPA shall set emissions limits, at least for major sources, at a level which can be achieved using, I think the phrase is the maximum available control technology. That's an example of that. Generally, under the Clean Water Act, emissions limits for point sources depend on available technology. OSHA, in its toxins provision, the provision basically, it's sort of a hybrid. It says maximize safety up to the point which is feasible given technology. Shifting to the second part of the underlying criteria, namely their sensitivity to population size, environmental agencies very frequently use criteria which are not sensitive to population size. And the classic example of this, and I've written about this probably at much too much length, is so-called individual risk tests, right? A very standard approach, and I go through this a little more in the paper, is to look at the population exposed to some pollutant, right? So the folks who would breathe some air toxin, or the folks who would be exposed to some toxin spread through groundwater near a hazardous waste site, or the folks who would consume some food additive, right? look at the exposure of someone in that exposure distribution. So perhaps the median person, perhaps a highly exposed person, or 90th percentile exposure, perhaps the maximally exposed person, and then regulate the pollution or the additive so that that individual risk, right, the incremental fatality risk imposed on that person is below some threshold, typically 1 in a million or 1 in 100,000, right? And the point is, that's not, at least in its pure form, that's not sensitive to population size. So for example, FDA says we'll license an additive if the risk to the 90th percentile consumer is below 1 in a million, and we won't license an additive if it's above 1 in a million. And that's true regardless of whether this is a specialty food consumed by a very small population or a food consumed by a much bigger population, and regardless of whether the relevant costs are fixed or variable. Okay, let me, well, I should do okay here. So this is underlying criteria, 2 features of the tests which are used by environmental agencies, namely that they're not always multidimensional and they're not always sensitive to population size. These are both real possibilities, right, in the area of natural hazards regulation. That is, agencies like FEMA and the Army Corps could well use tests which are either not multidimensional or not sensitive to population size, or both. Some examples: technology-based tests. In thinking about what you mean by these sort of technology-based criteria, there are a number of possibilities, right? Sometimes when environmental agencies use technology-based tests for setting emissions levels, they're looking at what's possible, the degree of emissions reduction which is possible given current, given the current state of the art in terms of engineering. Sometimes what they're doing is not that, but rather looking to prevailing norms. So the emissions level might be set at a level which would be achieved using technology which the median firm uses, or using technology with which most firms use. So it's kind of a norms practice variant of a technology-based approach as opposed to sort of pure engineering possibility. And finally, you might use a criterion which looks to specific technological rules of thumb. Now, in terms of natural hazards, I think the pure engineering possibility approach is crazy, right? No one thinks that. I mean, no one thinks that. I mean, it's possible to build a levee which is 200 feet high, right? It's possible in terms of evacuation and warning technology to evacuate everyone from the Gulf Coast for all of hurricane season, right? Or to have a personal representative from the state warn everyone in person, right? I mean, these are physically, technologically possible. That really, I think, is a non-starter. More viable are either sort of the norms practices variants of technology-based approaches or the rules of thumb. In terms of norms practices, you might just benchmark. And indeed, I think I have to look into this more, but I understand that the design of seismic codes often takes this form. That is, you look at what the current generation, right, of seismically resistant buildings or buildings, built with the intention to resist earthquakes. You look at how resistant they are, and then you set the codes to achieve that, either the level of the most resistant building or the median building and so forth. As to the use of specific technological rules of thumb, there's a great example which I came across, which has to do with a specific rule of thumb which the Army Corps uses in designing levees. When, at least historically, when the Army Corps has tried to build a levee to resist the 100-year flood, right, there's some uncertainty about what exactly that level is. There's also some uncertainty with respect to the so-called stage-discharge relationship. That is, the 100-year flood itself is a matter of a discharge, a certain kind of water flow. What stage, how high a river is that going to generate? There's some uncertainty there. So the typical practice of the Army Corps for a long time apparently has been to just simply add 3 more feet. Right? It's a nice sort of specific technological rule of thumb. Another example of, and again, very widely used, kind of policy analytic criterion in the natural hazards area, which is not multidimensional, doesn't focus on well-being at all, and for that matter is not population size sensitive, are failure risk tests, right? Building structures, and again, these are most applicable either to levees or to seismic design, and are very, as far, I'm edging myself about all this, but my sense is these are quite standard, and this obviously dovetails nicely with Tom and Doug's talk. To build the structure to withstand all but a rare event, right? And that can occur in two ways. Either you specify a particular scenario, so the standard project flood. What is the most extreme flood which could occur in an area which is not which is reasonably likely. So it's not any possible flood, but the most likely sort of a qualitative judgment of likeliness, and then you come up with a large flood and then build the structure to resist that. Similarly with a scenario earthquake, or it might be more quantitative. That is, you build the levee to withstand the 100-year flood, the flood which has a probability in any given year of only 1% of occurring, or the 500-year earthquake, and those indeed are the standard levels. Okay, so the point to see, and I guess I'll stop here because I want to give you guys time and want to have time to talk. These sort of criteria, right, deviate, I want to say. So safety-focused tests, technology-based tests used by environmental regulators, or technology-based tests, failure risk tests used by natural hazards regulators deviate, right? There's a disjunction between those, and I want to suggest the underlying moral criteria over welfare, as well as equity and rights, in two ways. One, in not being multidimensional, and two, in not being a sensitive population size. That may be fine, right? That may be right, but to decide whether that's right, you really need to engage in this kind of comparative institutional analysis. You have to think about whether these alternative criteria, number one, have lower decision costs, right? It may be very expensive to do a cost-benefit analysis. It may be, just cheaper in terms of reaching a decision to do a failure risk analysis. And obviously, you have to think about institutional competence, right? It may well be that when you give an agency instruction to engage in sort of an open-ended multidimensional analysis, that it sort of screws that up, right? One piece of evidence, perhaps, is the history of the Army Corps in using cost-benefit analysis, right? Arguably, it's not done that very well, right? Another piece of evidence, perhaps, is the role of technology-based tests in reviving Section 112 of the Clean Air Act. These have been much more successful than under the previous version, which was didn't use a technological rule, which uses a safety maximization kind of rule. The points I'd make about that is, number one, I think the comparative decision cost point is becoming less important. That is, with the improvements in computers, improvements in software, improvements in data, I mean, we now have very informative GIS systems which can tell us about the location of individuals and property at different points, right? It's not going to be that much more expensive to do a cost-benefit analysis or a multidimensional equity analysis as compared to, say, a failure risk type analysis. And so really, one has to think about the comparative competence of agencies as opposed to legislatures, because this is the final point, and I'll stop here. Ultimately, someone in the chain, I want to say, has got to do a multidimensional analysis, right? Might be the agency under broad delegation, might be the legislature, right, specifying a more specific statute, might be academics, right? There's a long-standing role, in effect, for academics doing cost-benefit analysis and cognate kinds of multidimensional analysis through commission reports and so forth. And maybe that's the way to do it, right? But at the end of the day, in specifying the content of our technology-based tests, or in specifying the relevant risks for our failure risk tests and so on, right, that's got to be grounded on a more multidimensional and population size sensitive analysis by someone. And I'll stop there and give it to these guys.
While he's doing that, I will get started here. What we wanted to look at is causation. This will be a little more familiar to probably most of you. Cause and fact, you all had this in tort law, and the Katrina catastrophe has given us really a marvelous opportunity to look at the question of causation. Nobody, of course, disputes the causal connection between the failure of the levees and the flooding of the city. But as you get into it in more detail, you discover that, well, causation analysis isn't quite that simple. And of course, the critical question of why the levees failed has generated a considerable disagreement and is a much more difficult question to answer. Now, the way this got started for Doug and I was we were both members of an organization called the Center for Progressive Reform. And just as the hurricane hit, we have a number of environmental justice types of folks in this organization, and just law professors, economists, and a couple of scientists as well. The listserv just sprung to life. People just needed to talk about this, so we started talking about it, and we decided, why don't we do a report on this? We can do a report. Let's divide up the work. And Doug was interested in cost-benefit analysis, and particularly how the Corps had been doing cost-benefit analysis. And he said, well, I'll look at, the role that there's a cost-benefit story here. And so I joined that group. I thought that'd be a good group to join. And within a couple of days, as Doug started digging around, after the hurricane, here comes an email that says, brace yourself. Okay, and that was the title of it. And you look at it, and Doug says, well, it turns out there was this lawsuit filed by environmental groups that stopped this barrier project from being built that would have kept the floodwaters or storm surge out of Lake Pontchartrain. So I'll bet you they're going to blame the environmentalists. And I said, I'll bet you you're right, Doug. And so we quickly got into this, learned as much as we could about it, went back in the old documents. Doug has a few of them here, the congressional hearings and all that, to see if there was any truth to this, because we knew it was coming. We came up with kind of an initial answer to it, and still nothing had come. Then about 2 weeks after the hurricane, here it comes. An old retired captain from the Army Corps says, you know, if we'd have just built that barrier project that I wanted to build, we would have saved New Orleans. And it didn't take a second till Emmett Tyrrell in the National Review talked about the lawsuit that flooded New Orleans. And then it was all over the blogosphere. It was everywhere about how the environmentalists had killed New Orleans. We were kind of prepared for that. We did a little separate report just for that. And what that experience, it really dovetailed with another experience I'd had in writing an article about cost analysis, cost-benefit analysis, and where I have been advocating for a long time retrospective analysis of costs and benefits. Let's look back and see how much it really did cost, right? It seemed to me that was at least was warranted, because you look at these league tables, as they call them, of how many costs per life saved and how many dollars per life saved and all that. When you actually look at the cost side of that, the dollars, you find out they're never what really was spent. Ever that. It's always a summation of what was projected to be spent at the time that the regulation was promulgated, many of which were never promulgated. Okay, so those tend to be very misleading. So I said, well, it seems simple enough. I said, well, let's go back and find out how much it did cost. Well, it turns out it's not so simple. It's not that simple either. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about hindsight analysis on the lawsuit that drowned New Orleans idea from my old and aging perspective, and then young Dr. Kysar here is going to talk about foresight analysis and what this might teach us about foresight analysis. First, we wanted to look at the levee system. If you can just put that up there and show me what. New Orleans is divided into 4 poldars, 3 of which are clear here. The 4th one just goes, it's not really even New Orleans. It goes down the Mississippi River and protects, it's really a thin space there where people live between the river and the marshes and the swamps. The first levee here is not really on the map either, but it's along the Mississippi River. That levee system is not at issue here. We didn't stop somebody else from writing an op-ed saying that a lawsuit 200 miles up the Mississippi about the levee system on the Mississippi River, which didn't flood, had nothing to do with the flooding, drowned New Orleans, okay? So some of these things we can just toss off, except that they're out there and they're sort of part of the mythology already. This levee is much taller than the other levees. It's much stronger. Not a problem. It does have a problem when it rains a lot in Illinois, but it's not a problem. Wasn't a problem with the storm surge coming up from the Gulf, which is right out in this area. Okay. We have the poldar here, and poldar is a Dutch word for an area protected by. They have that word, not surprisingly, for an area protected by levees. Right. So the first poldar is this one right here, protecting the downtown area. The next one is an area here, the lower Ninth Ward, you sometimes hear referred to. This area is St. Bernard Parish. There's a great deal of marsh out in this area right here. That's marshy land and not really developed. Going back to Hurricane Betsy in 1965, there was a reassessment of what happened, because the city did flood, not as badly as it did in Hurricane Katrina, and a lot of time and money spent on what we should do about this. And a project was came up with, and I always forget exactly the wording of it. Let me see if I can find it here. The Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity Hurricane Protection Project, or the LPVHPP, which we talked about in the paper, explored the Corps of Engineers, which of course is responsible for building these levees, though the people in the vicinities also pay some share of the cost of this. The Corps of Engineers came up with two options. One was the high levee option, that is, let's just build these levees, strengthen them, reinforce them, and build them bigger, so that they'll protect against a flood that's more than Hurricane Betsy in intensity. The other was a barrier project that right up in this area here, you can see a little area going there, and there's another one that goes up through there. That's Chef Mentour and the Rigolet. Those are passes that have existed since the last part of the 19th century. In fact, as I was going back and looking at this, and finding out what Chef Mentour was, there's a whole website on Chef Mentour because it has a lighthouse. Hurricane Katrina took care of that. So there's a historical society devoted to Chef Mentour. The idea was to build a barrier across both of these places, just a gate that would come down, floodgate, if you would, a massive sea gate, and stop the water rushing up Lake Bourne into Lake Pontchartrain, because the water from Lake Pontchartrain has pretty direct access to the city. All right, how does that happen? Well, if a storm surge gets in Lake Pontchartrain, or even if the winds are really very heavily out of the northeast, which happens if the hurricane happens to go just a little to the east of town, which is what happened, the water gets pressed up against this levee system here. Okay, the levee system, let's go back up between those two projects. The Corps of Engineers decided to go with the barrier project, started building a levee out in this area here, and then in 1976 was stopped when a lawsuit was filed by some fishermen in Lake Pontchartrain who were concerned about the impact on Lake Pontchartrain of stopping this natural flow back and forth with the tides, and a local environmental group called Save Our Wetlands. The lawsuit resulted in an injunction. There was a final environmental impact statement prepared. It was inadequate. Doug and I concluded, yes, it was a grossly inadequate environmental impact statement. You can read the court's opinion. It's pretty clear that it was inadequate. The judge said, go back. I'm telling you, I'm not stopping this project other than just to have you write a good impact statement. They wrote the impact statement, or their work went back to start writing on the impact statement, started reevaluating the costs and benefits, doing a cost-benefit analysis, found out that the costs were mounting. Well, why were the costs mounting? One reason is, in condemning this land out here to do this, people were being resistant. Somewhat were just being holdouts because they didn't want the thing built in the first place, but they were requiring them to condemn the property. That costs a lot more, takes a lot more time. Costs were mounting. The political opposition was mounting too. Where was that coming from? It was coming from people who didn't want to spend a lot of money on, which they would have to pay out of their taxes as well, on a project that might hurt Lake Pontchartrain, which is a great natural resource to the city. Two, some were concerned that had they built this thing, there would be a whole area of land here that you see as marsh, but would have been developable, and in fact, much of which was either owned or connected to local politicians. So they were a little worried about a land grab at stake here. And finally, people on the other side, up here in, which you really can't see, of Lake Bourne, and I take it also here too, but mostly from a parish up north, were worried if you put up these sea gates, where's the water going to go? Well, it's going to come flood us. And if it floods us, our land isn't going to be worth as much. So you had resistance coming, political resistance, and ultimately over about a 5-year period, the Corps decided not to build the barrier project, go back to the high-level project, which in many ways was kind of the easy way of doing it. It may still be that a barrier is the right thing to do. The barrier they would have built would have withstood something called the Standard Project Hurricane, which, as Doug's going to elaborate on a little more, was a construct that, in fact, could not have existed, as we find out now. Nature couldn't produce such an animal, but it was roughly the equivalent of a fast-moving Category 3 on the Safford-Simpson scale. Okay, the lawsuits filed. They changed their mind. They built the high levee project. That was in place by Hurricane Katrina. So what happened during Hurricane Katrina? First, Lake Pontchartrain, there was a storm surge in Lake Pontchartrain. Okay, it did flood. We have these little outlet canals here. Those are there because the city, much of the city, except on this crescent here on the Mississippi River, is below sea level. So when it rains, the water stays. It doesn't drain, okay? These canals have huge pumps associated with them that allow water to be pumped out during rainfall events. And of course, during hurricanes is one major rainfall event. So you want those things open. So you can't have them closed because you need to be pumping out, getting the water out of it. So that's a problem. The flooding now, it has been determined, although this could still be, debatable, some uncertainties. The storm surge did not overtop these levees, nor did they overtop the levees and flood walls that are lining these outfall canals, 2 of which did breach. The 17th Street one did, and the London Avenue breach. That's where a lot of the worst flooding happened, in the downtown area, which is the most heavily developed and where the more of the wealthier folks live. Okay, but the storm surge really came in from here. The storm moved just up, like just east of town, okay? A huge surge came from Lake Bourne directly across the levees, outlining this Mississippi Gulf Outlet Canal, Mississippi River Gulf Outlet Canal. Now that is a canal that was built just about the same time, just before 1960, to be a shortcut to the Gulf of Mexico. From right here, just takes you straight down. The idea was ocean-going vessels could do that rather than take this intercoastal waterway way on out. In fact, this goes all the way from Texas to Florida, from Corpus Christi all the way to Florida, but could get straight out to the Gulf, and large ocean-going vessels could use that. This canal right here, called the Industrial Canal, was built simply to facilitate a quick shot between Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River for vessels that wanted to just get from one place to the other without having to go all the way around. All right. Lake Bourne flooded all of this area here, which did have some development on it. It's not totally undeveloped. The surge totally took that out. Took out all the levees, and you see these spots where, let's say, there are breaches. This levee system is 80% wiped out. It just took this out altogether, which then flooded the St. Bernard's Parish areas here. Okay, came up the Mississippi Gulf, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, where it conjoins here with the intercoastal waterway, as a funnel effect, and you can sort of see the funnel aspect of it. It turns out that although it was built to be the same width, and it looks the same width here, it's about 2,000 feet wide here, and it narrows down to about 200 feet here, just due to erosion over the years. So it sends this surge up the funnel to the industrial canal. That, of course, overtop these levees here, so this area all floods. Now this is your lower ninth ward. This is where some of the real tragedies happen. Hits the intercoastal canal, and the navigational canal here. And here's where we have some questions. First of all, let's just stop before we get into the more complex questions here. Had you built the barriers here, it would not have stopped this flooding from happening. It wouldn't have stopped a drop of water from going up the Mississippi River Gulf outlet canal. Okay, it might have even made it worse by putting more water in Lake Bourne. Probably not a whole lot worse, but if anything, could have made it worse, because these would have been shut here and they couldn't have gotten through to Lake Pontchartrain. The storm surge was the idea, if it would have worked. Okay, so these areas are going to have flooded whether or not the barrier was there. As a matter of causation, that was going to but-for cause. They're not a but-for cause. It's a little tougher with this one. This actually, the breach here allowed flooding in the downtown area. Here it's harder. It looks an awful lot like the surge just burst. You can see it's right at about the place of conjoining of the two. As it came over and broke these levees here along the western side of the industrial canal. There's an eyewitness who's here at the lock who testifies to that effect. In fact, the surge from Lake Pontchartrain happened several hours later as the storm moved north. First surge comes in as the storm's coming up the coast into New Orleans. And he said then we had another surge here. It's conceivable that either one of those surges could have broken that levee there. That's interesting from a but-for perspective, because that's now, if you remember, go back to your tort law, that's the Anderson versus Twin, the two fires case, right? That's where the fire merges from one fire merges with another fire. And from a standpoint of blameworthiness, the court there decided to put liability on the one that had a human actor associated with it. So I suppose you could say in that case, if either one of these would have caused that levee to flood, even though both did, then not building the barrier may have had something to do with it. But we've got to go back. We've got to continue the process here. These levees here, and I want to keep track of my time, clearly were associated with Lake Pontchartrain. Okay, so our causation, our hindsight analysis now, and the nature of hindsight analysis, of course, is you try to construct an accurate historical representation of what did happen. That's what I've been trying to do right here. What do is do my best as possible job of telling you what did happen. You compare that then to a counterfactual, that is a model, that is a scenario, and there may be many scenarios of what didn't happen, but would have happened if the event or thing that is your alleged cause had not occurred. In this case, what we're trying to do is compare what did happen with what would have happened had these barriers been built, these seawalls here. Okay, that helps us answer the question of whether not the lawsuit doesn't answer the question, but it starts us along the path of answering the question whether the lawsuit sunk New Orleans. Here, conceivably so. Now, first of all, these levees didn't breach. They weren't overtopped, neither were these. What now appears to be the case is that the water inside the canals rushing up pushed them out because they were not sufficiently secured in the ground because there was soft clay beneath them, and literally pushed the flood walls out and allowed them into the city, allowed the water into the city. So it wasn't that the storm surge overtopped the levees and then sort of scoured it out afterwards, as the Corps initially thought, but rather that they weren't built to withstand this kind of surge. There are several possibilities for why that's the case. The fact that they weren't sunk low enough, they didn't use connectors as they went underground, but just went straight down. Various possibilities that the contractor just screwed up, or even fraud in the 80s as they were building these the high level projects. And those are also possible culpable actors, of course. But arguably, none of this would have happened if we'd have just had the barriers, right? That's one that requires a fair amount of analysis when you think about it, because had you had the barriers, the storm surge still might have overflowed the barriers, right? Because it was a big storm surge. It was 25 feet right in this area here. We had 12 to 15 foot levees along here, and those were completely wiped out. With this levees, which were about have been about the same size, maybe slightly smaller, with this levee system here and the flood walls that withstood that, maybe not. If it hadn't, though, would it have slowed down the velocity? Yes, almost certainly. It would have slowed down the velocity of the surge as it moved. Would it have lowered its intensity? Conceivably. Right? Insofar as it's attributable to Lake Bourne and the Gulf of Mexico here to the east, yeah, it might have lowered the intensity. But remember, the storm now again still comes up this way, and once it passes this point here, and the winds now are whipping around, they're bringing water straight from Lake Pontchartrain right up those levees. Was there enough water in Lake Pontchartrain to cause the kind of pressure that caused those levees to break? Even if the barriers have been broken, conceivably so. There's a lot of water in Lake Pontchartrain, and it's all getting pushed in this huge surge now by the hurricane. Not a 20-foot surge from the Gulf, but it is being pushed by wind right against New Orleans. So that's a question that one would have to answer in a counterfactual scenario. We're not done, though. The next question, of course, is, did the lawsuit stop the barriers from being constructed? And I sort of suggested the answer to you as I talked about the reason that the Corps changed its mind to the extent that it was going to change its mind anyway. Maybe it would have just proceeded bullheaded ahead without the lawsuit. What it does seem to us is that the lawsuit gave a moment of pause during which the agency reconsidered the alternatives it was considering and elected a different one. That's precisely what NEPA was enacted to do, is cause that pause. Now, whether that turned out to be a bad decision is something that's subject to hindsight analysis. It certainly wasn't a bad decision as far as these folks here and these folks here are concerned. Probably not a bad decision insofar as these folks here are concerned. Maybe a bad decision as far as these folks are concerned. But you have a lot, you also, of course, have to assume that these levees would have been built well, whereas we know that these weren't. Anyway, so that's kind of the hindsight, looking back, comparing what did happen to a counterfactual. Now, Doug wants to carry this forward to what we can learn in the future. Sorry.
Well, thanks, Tom. Thanks. So as Tom described, at this point, the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that the lawsuit played a significant role in causing the levee failures in New Orleans. Still, we do think it remains important to examine the original Lake Pontchartrain protection design process for sort of forward-looking lessons as well as backward-looking ones. Whether or not Katrina was the proverbial big one that experts seem to think New Orleans levees, even if they had been perfectly constructed and maintained, were not going to be able to withstand. It seems, we've got a situation where unanimous experts agreed that a Category 4 or 5 hurricane on a critical path would eventually overwhelm even a perfectly designed system. So how did we get to a point where we're spending upwards of $800 million on a system that, even according to its intended design, was inadequate to protect against a storm that experts regarded as quite foreseeable? Well, in the days following Katrina, we kept hearing descriptions about the levees that described their degree of intended protection in fairly ambiguous terms. We kept hearing the phrase roughly equivalent to a fast-moving Category 3 storm on the Saffir-Simpson scale. We also heard descriptions of the levee system as being designed to guard against the worst storm we could expect over a 200 or 300-year period. Neither of those descriptions, it turns out, bears a direct relationship to the actual manner in which the levee systems work. Because the initial design process was initiated well before the Saffir-Simpson scale was even developed by meteorologists. The Army Corps needed other tools of modeling, other tools of characterizing hurricanes. And the model that they came upon, and the one that they continue to use in a much enhanced and improved fashion, was something known as the Standard Project Hurricane, or the SPH, as we'll call it. The SPH was developed by the engineers in conjunction with the U.S. Weather Bureau pursuant to the National Hurricane Research Program, which Congress had authorized in 1955, following a particularly severe storm season the year before. The SPH was developed to, quote, provide generalized hurricane specifications that are consistent geographically and meteorologically for use in planning, evaluating, and establishing hurricane design criteria for hurricane protection works. Now, as we note in the paper, the SPH eventually took on a sort of life of its own, carrying a normative weight that seems, to us at least, to be out of proportion to the actual empirical basis of the model, at least when we examine it in hindsight. So the SPH first appeared in National Hurricane Research Program Report number 33, issued in 1959. The authors of the study began by dividing the eastern and the Gulf coasts of the United States into regional zones, with New Orleans falling in Zone B, which is the one that I'll focus on primarily here. After dividing up the country in this way, we compiled data on all tropical storms in those zones from 1900 to 1956, all storms that eventually reached hurricane intensity at some point during their lifespans. And I apologize for the really poor quality of these slides. I promise it's not a vision test. So as the authors acknowledged in this 59 report, much of the data that they were using was very unreliable, given that they were using, at that point, very imprecise measurement technology. In particular, much of the data had to be extrapolated from land-based measurements to estimates of the offshore central pressure of hurricanes, because it wasn't until well past the middle of the century that we began using airplanes to fly out and measure pressure offshore. But even assuming valid measurements, we're still only dealing with a 57-year record at this point, only 21 storms in the case of Zone B here, which obviously was not enough to generate anything like a statistically significant distribution of the overall distribution of potential storms from a multi-kind of century perspective. And even with respect to the data that was available, I note that this bottom storm, the 1957 storm, has a little asterisk next to it, and that's because the footnote discloses that the storm wasn't used in the construction of the design parameters because it happened after they'd already done the calculations of the frequency index. Just so it turns out this is the most severe storm in the database. The researchers then took this storm database and using recorded central pressure as the primary determinant of storm intensity, they proceeded to calculate the cumulative number of storms that appeared during their observation period at various levels of pressure or below. Now, generally speaking, the lower the pressure, the more intense the storm, the greater the storm surge potential. So the idea being that as you get higher in pressure, you get more storms becoming more frequent. So this method then was, because again, we're dealing only with a 57-year record, so we then converted it linearly. We just linearly stretched out the data to a 100-year period so that we could then use, at the time, handy normal distribution graph paper. And the idea here is we're comparing, again, increasing pressure along here. Down here, we're plotting occurrences per 100 years. And the idea of this graph paper is that if we take the 100-year record and we plot it on this special graph paper, and then if we sort of identify the trend line, if the trend line is straight, then we can infer that Gulf Coast storms appear according to a normal distribution. They sort of behave according to a bell curve distribution. So now this is a debatable move. So if we look at Zone A here, which is sort of Texas and areas west of New Orleans, we see first a much different slope in the line that we've sort of forced onto the data. We also see some storms, at least this one in particular, that seem to want to drag our frequency way down. Now, of course, that's just one storm. And it's very difficult on this record to say whether that one storm represents a 100-year storm or 200-year or a 10,000-year storm. But that's precisely the point. With such a small, limited sample, there's really not a lot supporting the assumption that storm intensity will follow a normal distribution. So the decision, at least at this point, to extrapolate linearly is one that depends on, at least in the documents, a relatively unexamined, scrutinized assumption that the storm behavior follows this sort of tidy world of classical mathematics. It may well, but it may also represent instead what Dan Farber has called the world of probabilities behaving badly. That is a world in which complex adaptive systems are characterized not by normal probability distributions, but by power law distributions in which extreme events appear with a surprising regularity. Now, here's a few suggestive facts for us from the 2005 hurricane season. We had 27 named storms, the most on record, shattering the previous record of 21 storms from 1933. For the first time ever, meteorologists had to reach into the Greek alphabet for additional storm names. We had 15 hurricanes, breaking the old record of 12 set in 1969. We had the most Category 5 storms ever, 3 being Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. Wilma became the strongest hurricane on record in the Atlantic Basin, measured by, again, central pressure. 3 of the 6 strongest hurricanes on record occurred last year. Hurricane Katrina made landfall with wind speeds of 125 miles an hour and a minimum central pressure of 27.13 inches. 3rd lowest on record at landfall, behind Hurricane Camille from '69 and the Labor Day hurricane that struck the Florida Keys in 1935. I point those out because they'll reappear in our story in a moment. Katrina was the costliest U.S. hurricane on record, one of the deadliest. The overall season tally for damage last year, costliest in U.S. history. A couple lesser-known trivia bits here. Hurricane Vince, probably didn't hear about Hurricane Vince. The first known instance of a tropical cyclone ever making landfall in Spain. Hurricane Delta became only the 6th hurricane on record in December since 1851. And finally, tropical cyclone Zeta was the longest-lived tropical cyclone ever recorded in the month of January. So, is this a case of probabilities behaving badly? Perhaps, perhaps. But again, let's suppose we've got a good theoretical understanding of the underlying probability characteristics. Let's suppose we have a better empirical grasp of storm intensity and frequency. We still have the basic decision of how conservative to be in setting our benchmark for our standard project hurricane. The hurricane that, again, provides the basis for how we design, how high our levee walls and barrier gates will be. So the 59 researchers focused on central barometric pressure, and they developed a table that reflected the lowest pressure that you would expect at various geographic locations with an annual frequency of 1%. So in other words, they chose the 100-year return period for central pressure, and then they sort of used that to develop this map which shows the varying degrees of estimated 100-year return period for central pressure as you sort of go along the Gulf Coast. New Orleans is about 660, so we're right in here. And although we're showing here the 0.5 occurrence per 100 years, that would be a 200-year return. The SPH was built off of the 100-year return. So for New Orleans, the 100-year estimate was 27.6 inches. Now, this was not equivalent to a 100-year storm because we're fixing on central pressure, but then we interpolate that with other features like wind speed and track and wind radius, other characteristics, which meant that in combination, we were looking at something higher than a 100-year return period. That's why the levee system in New Orleans was described as a 200 to 300-year protection system. Still, though, why anchor on the 100-year central pressure index? In 1953, after a terrible storm killed 2,000 people in the Netherlands, the Dutch resolved to build a barrier system that would guard against a 10,000-year storm. Why didn't we anchor on the 10,000-year central pressure index? Well, we find some clues in contemporaneous descriptions of the SPH, where commentators describe the model as being used to project the worst storm that's economically reasonable to guard against. In fact, some core economists at the time believed the SPH was, in fact, too cautious, that a less severe storm should be used as the benchmark for disaster planning and prevention, given the cost involved. But these considerations are not transparent in the model itself. Nowhere in the technical reports is any analysis given of what is economically reasonable. The 72 interim update of the SPH simply describes the 100-year choice for pressure as arbitrary, and then it proceeds to update the model with new data based still on that admittedly arbitrary assumption. That murky blending of science and policy continues during the much more elaborate and technical 79 overhaul of the SPH. Now we've got a better empirical record, we've got improved scientific understanding, much more elaborate computer capabilities, and so we construct not only a much better SPH at this point, but an alternative model dubbed the maximum probable hurricane, which actually attempted to take a much longer 10,000-year kind of view and see what's actually the worst case outcome we might expect. So obviously the choice to use an SPH or an MPH is not purely a technical choice, that there are economic and political and normative considerations that have to go into that choice. The other thing that happened in '79 is that the SPH was changed so that the critical parameter for pressure was no longer based on a 100-year return period. Instead, the researchers switched to just finding an average of the 7 lowest storms that have actually been observed. And it's hard to see in this sort of bad scan but this sort of line along here is the new revised 79 SPH, which lowers for New Orleans our expected central pressure to about 27.3 inches, which is below this other line, which had been the 79 update. Now, there seems to be an improvement, but it still begs the question, why not take the lowest 5 storms or the lowest 3 storms? Or why not just take the lowest storm full stop? In fact, the researchers did something even stranger to us, which is they excluded the 2 worst storms from their 7 lowest storm index. Hurricane Camille from 1969 and the Labor Day storm from 1935. Again, the 2 storms on record that had a lower central pressure than Katrina. These storms were simply deemed outliers. At this stage, the researchers say, we decided the curve not considering Camille and the Keys should be used. Our decision was based on the idea that these 2 hurricanes resulted in sustained wind speeds that were not reasonably characteristic. And that's it. That's the extent of the analysis. Still, the new conservative approach here did result, as I said, in lowering further the New Orleans SPH down to 27.30. But remember, Hurricane Katrina landed with a pressure of 27.13 inches, an intensity that was clearly foreseeable when we looked then to the probable maximum hurricane, which here we see is 1.5 inches lower in pressure, or 1.5 inches greater in drop, as the way they've set it up here, for the area of New Orleans. So those are just a few of the anomalies that we discovered in the design and the use of the SPH. We don't at all mean to be criticizing the researchers involved in these reports. They're doing the best they can. I, in fact, had to hire a PhD engineering student just to begin to understand what was going on in them. So no doubt their work was carefully, earnestly done. And we suspect there were no doubt many influences and conversations from other channels that went into some of these seemingly arbitrary decisions that are not reflected again in the paper record. But again, that's a large part of our point in this paper. Procedurally oriented public involvement statutes like NEPA serve a vital, long recognized disinfectant role. They expose the decision-making of experts and agency officials to scrutiny. They allow modeling assumptions to be unearthed and evaluated in a way that counteracts what we regard as a sort of our seemingly overwhelming desire to mask our most difficult policy choices within the nuances of technical models, arbitrary as they may be. So with that bit of bait for Professor Adler, we'd love to hear any questions or comments. Or
kind of a long question that addresses, and it's actually addressed, is in 2 parts and addresses both Matthew's and the second story. When I heard Professor Adler's story about the need for multidimensional assessments, my first reaction was a bit of skepticism in that, I mean, in essence, all of that is true, but in setting such a wide range of criteria becomes the issue, and you hint to it early on, actually, in the paper as well, that attains a certain complexity, which is very hard to overcome. You start to put things in there that are very hard to compare. You can't really, if you say if some criteria are utilitarian, others are not, and so that begs the question: are we looking for something that's Pareto superiority, and then in ultimate assessment? And actually, my own experience with impact assessment is very pragmatic in that I was involved with advising a manual and a checklist for impact assessments for the government in Belgium. And I remember, very well remember sitting at the negotiation table with the bureaucrats, and one of the main issues was that they didn't want us to put that much stuff in it. Because, first of all, it seemed impossible for them. The more we went on the continuum of including other dimensions, they were totally against that, in that there's no way we will be able to do that cost-wise, but also an underlying sentiment of really saying, well, this is going to open us to liability. And I guess all of those things then, seem to dictate either that we work towards a hierarchy of those things if we can't really trade them off, or interesting thing that you raise is that who's got to do it, right? And so maybe the policymaker. But then when I listen to the second story, I feel it kind of emphasized the importance of multidimensional assessments, in that in Doug, you have this really beautiful example of how, as you say, you can't really blame the analysts in their design of the SPH, because they're working really on one simple dimension. And from that dimension, it's correct what they're doing. But the overall picture is one where we're shorting something. You mentioned 800 million. Well, it ended up costing 800 billion, right? And so you ask the question, why did the Dutch go 10,000 years? Maybe because they did consider these other dimensions. And then I think of all the things that Professor Adler said, the job loss, all of those things. And if you put all those dimensions in there, you just get a much clearer picture of what should be done. And despite issues of hindsight, my sentiment putting those things together is that really there was a lot of improvement to be done in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And then then even the stories of hindsight don't seem so persuasive anymore, because it seems like such a discrepancy between the costs that could have been avoided if we did a better job. Or I'm just trying to piece this together. I know I'm
not, again, at the end of the day, I'm agnostic on institutional questions. But the point is this. Imagine you're a member of Congress, right, and you're trying to decide, what the organic statute for the Army Corps or for FEMA or for some other agency should say. Or let's step back one step. Let's imagine you've been asked by Congress to give advice. You're a member of a a blue ribbon commission, right? So you begin from the beginning. You think about, right, this is a normative question, right? So you think about, well, what are the normative criteria that I find persuasive? Now maybe you say, well, that's a matter for democracy, right? So fine. So that, but in a way, that answer, the democratic answer, which is that I myself don't need to decide moral issues, I can just leave that democratic process, simply shifts the conversation. So let's imagine you're part of the democratic process. You're a citizen now engaged, right, debating these things in Congress, right? My suggestion, and it's not wholly uncontroversial, but it's relatively uncontroversial, is that you're going to come up with a specific view within the family. I mean, what I'm calling weak welfare is actually a family of views, right? And any such specific view within this broad family is going to be multidimensional. You're going to recognize, number one, that human well-being is at least one of our aims. That well-being is multidimensional, right? It's not about just maximizing longevity, right? That's not, I mean, the best human life is not the longest life, even if there's nothing else goes on in your life, right? Now, so you recognize this. Now, you may recognize that, number one, that there may not be commensurability, right? This is why, I mean, cost-benefit tries to commensurate. Maybe the best way to figure out what maximizes well-being, what equity is not to commensurate. But still, even if you don't commensurate, you're going to want to, bracketing decision costs, right, try to characterize the effects along the different dimensions of well-being. Now, at that point, you may recognize that, boy, that's expensive too, right? So, for example, I've written elsewhere in favor of fear assessment. right? Agencies typically don't do that, right? They don't quantify fear effects because it's hard to do that. But at a minimum, I mean, here, now we can be a little more concrete, right? The technology is there, right? There's huge scholarly literatures that quantify agency impacts with respect to at least two things, right? Health and safety and property flows. That's true in environmental policy making, that's true for natural hazards, right? So at least to that extent, right, either you instruct the agency to do that, or you yourself, as part of this democratic conversation, want to get some handle, I would say, on, at a minimum, what the life and safety impacts are and what the property impacts are. Now, the upshot of that might be, it might be that you give a more specific instruction to your levy designers, right? Now, what's that going to be? I mean, this is, in a way, my question for Tom and Doug. I mean, my sense is that if you look, not just, in this example, but globally, at the criteria which are used for either flood design or seismic design, they either take the form of the agencies themselves engaging in a kind of cost-benefit analysis, or they have this sort of engineering form, and in turn, that either has the form of identifying a standard project event, which I agree is problematic because it's, why this event or another event, or, I mean, the cutting edge version, the more recent version of that is to identify a recurrence interval, right? To build a structure which is going to resist all but the 100-year flood, right? It's not, I mean, those would seem to be the alternatives, right? And in those alternatives, this engineering risk approach isn't multidimensional, right? It's focused on engineering reliability as opposed to safety and cost and so forth. But this really is a point for these guys. I mean, to do that or any other approach, right, there's going to be some kind of uncertainty analysis. I mean, number one, because the events aren't certain, right? And so it's hard to see how you're going to implement any one of these without using probabilities. But so the answer is a long-winded way of saying I agree that the actual criteria employed by builders and so forth may not appropriately be multidimensional. At bottom, though, right, we care about is multidimensional, and at least some of those things are right now amenable to quantification without huge decision costs.
There's a couple of things in what Matt said that are of interest to me, and I, first of all, when we hand this business over to the analysts, totally, we get what Doug highlighted, that is, we get the moral and various other dimensions folded in and hidden from us. So we need to be cautious of that, but that's something that we can deal with things like NEPA and making sure that the analysis is transparent. Over and over today, and I noted in your paper, we've talked about multidimensional analysis, and if we're just talking about analysis and not decision criteria, okay, but just the analysis, and we keep saying multidimensional analysis, it's always equated with cost-benefit analysis, and to me that seems so odd because multidimensional analysis.
I'm not saying that. I mean, I'm
well,
let me be clear about that.
You didn't at the very end because you said, well, we wouldn't commensurability is an issue, but if one and I, grew up my undergraduate education was in physics, and I grew up thinking about multi-dimensions, right? And so when I think of a multi-dimensional analysis, I think of an analysis that's along many dimensions. So I talk about along this dimension, how far does it go? Along this dimension, how far does it go? And then I don't conflate all the dimensions into two and turn it into a piece of paper just because that's what we sort of need to understand, or lots of people need in order to see it. I had a blind friend who was a physicist who I swear could see in 4 dimensions. Okay, he was that good. I can't see in 4 dimensions. I can see in 3, but still, we shouldn't let that stop us from viewing multidimensional phenomena multidimensionally and not 2-dimensionally, which is what cost-benefit analysis does. Anyway.
I'd just also point out this is the naysayer point, but $800 million for the levees versus $100+ billion in damage. Seems like we underinvested in protection, but it could be that that's a sort of hindsight fallacy, and that if we wind the clock back and we think about, well, was Katrina a 10,000-year storm? What was the actual probability of Katrina? It could quite well be that it was rationally at the time not to scale up the project anymore. The Army Corps at this time was discounting about 3.25% exponentially future costs and benefits. So I wouldn't need to push the frequency period out very far before that $100 billion got reduced to a very trivial present value. Now that to me suggests this is not the right way to think about long-term intergenerational disaster planning. To me it suggests that the sort of the cost-benefit framework is sort of, something's getting lost when we're reducing it to 2 dimensions. And I guess my defense of the kind of crude frequency period idea would be that I don't have to hire a PhD engineering student to understand it. It's something that I think citizens and people can get their head wrapped around. It's a way of it's like the Iroquois Constitution 7-generation heuristic. It's just a way of making that seem somehow more present and real and accessible. And there's even psychological evidence about how much better people do in thinking about terms of probabilities and statistics when it's converted to those kind of alternative frames where we think in terms of 1 out of 100 rather than 1%.
I mean, just to be clear, and it's hard to be transparent. I mean, I've elsewhere argued in favor of cost benefit, but this is meant to be more agnostic. This is not an argument for cost benefit, right? I mean, Sunstein and POTUS. Before Sunstein got into cost benefit mode, he had this article with POTUS, right? Rethinking the regulatory state, or whatever it was, where he says, "I'm in favor of multidimensional analysis, which doesn't mean cost benefit analysis, right? Multidimensional doesn't mean it's also not 2-dimensional, right?" That was POTUS. But the point is, what I said before, right? So, in terms of the possibilities for designing seismically resistant structures or levees, the possibilities would seem to be either an engineering risk analysis or some kind of either qualitative cost-benefit analysis where you array costs and life-saving without commensurating them, or a quantitative cost-benefit analysis where you use dollars or some other commensurating scale. But as I've tried to make clear, right, ultimately which one you use is going to be a matter of decision costs, monitoring costs, the extent to which you think overall well-being, for which, in other work I've said, cost benefit or rough proxy is best specified by using a central commensurating scale or not. But the point, I mean, it's not, I think we can, well, there's this long-standing debate between sort of the proponents of cost benefit and the opponents, and what I'm actually trying to do here, maybe not successfully, is to make some progress by saying, I think there's a lot of middle ground, right? A lot of the middle ground, thoughtful people are going to disagree, or at least recognize that this issue of institutional competence, right, is very complicated. And I think thoughtful people will recognize that, again, overall well-being is not the only thing, although it's part of it, and that whatever we care about is going to be multidimensional in the way that I mean to describe, without making that equivalent to the use of dollars or some other sort of central commensurating scale.
This is a question mostly for Doug and Tom, but Matt, you may have some comments on it too. I found this really interesting, but I kind of want to ask a question about the paper you didn't write, which is inherently unfair, and you may want to just say next question, but let me try this. I don't know much about the environmental science underneath this, but there is this suggestion that equatorial waters are warming and that passing over warm waters increases the strength of storms. And doesn't it sort of make all of this kind of irrelevant? If the underlying phenomena is changing in a fundamental way,
yeah,
we could get to have the 100-year storm every other year. And if we do, in a way, I guess I could put this question in sort of Rumsfeldian terms by saying, we're talking here about the known unknowns, where you can draw probability distributions based on past data. What do we do about the unknown unknowns, about whether this underlying phenomenon is changing so quickly and in such unpredictable ways that we just can't make much sense of it?
But I think that's a great question. I mean, one of the key problems with the SPH as originally designed, and then it persisted, is that it happened at a point before ocean scientists understood the sort of, the multi-decanal warming cycle that sort of happens. So the data set kind of missed some of the key upswings. There was a key one at the end of the last century as well, and we're right in the thick of one right now. And then that's not unrelated to climate change. Now, it's impossible to attribute any one storm to climate change, but we can sort of over time project a warming of the oceans that will exacerbate those trends. So what it suggests to me is that there's the normativity of disaster planning will never be fully determined by empirics, that there will always be residual uncertainties that then when we boil them down at the end, they're moral criteria about how much we care about posterity and each other, the presently vulnerable as well. And that's what I don't want to see subsumed by technocratic decision-making.
But there are really two issues. I mean, I agree with that. Again, I don't think there's any disagreement at all. That is, at the end of the day, this is a moral question which the legislature is going to have to resolve. I think the disagreement, or what maybe disagreement, is whether you deal with uncertainty probabilistically and quantitatively or qualitatively. I mean, in general, all these events, right, whether it's floods, whether it's earthquakes, again, there's a limit to my mathematical ability here, but, or hurricanes, I take it, involve this kind of curve, where this is magnitude, right, and this is exceeding probability. Right, it's kind of, be it a flood frequency curve, right? This is probability, and this is magnitude. So, what's the probability of this? Would be say 1%, a 100-year flood, right? What's the magnitude of the event, such the probability of having an event of that size or bigger is 1%, right? This is similar. So I mean, this I take it is the sort of the shared model of flood risk assessment, earthquakes.
But that's where Farber's article comes in.
But here's the point, right? We don't know what that is, right? So we observe, right? We're stuck in this empirical world where we observe points, right? Well, now, the quantitative model, I mean, the model you're describing, the approach you're describing is sort of lagged in terms of the way modern quantitative uncertainty analysis works, right? The model you describe picks a particular functional form, say, a line, right? And does, assumes this is representative, right, of a long-term phenomenon, and does the best fit, right? The cutting-edge way to do this is to allow a multiplicity of functional forms, right? So it may be a straight line, it may be this, it may be this, right? You can assume, you take into consideration the possibility that this is actually biased as opposed to representative, right? So you may want to fit it up or down, right? I mean, the key question is whether you do all that quantitatively or qualitatively. I mean, I take it, I'd say you do it quantitatively, at least if you assume the decision maker is competent. And the decision maker may be the National Research Council, right? It may be that what you do is, the member of Congress, is not let, the Army Corps do this because you think they're captured, but bring in, a Blue Ribbon Commission to do it. But I want to suggest that at the end of the day, at least for large decisions, you should do it quantitatively. I mean, I'm imagining your response is, well, no, do it qualitatively.
Well, my understanding of the Monte Carlo techniques is that you still have to, the researcher has to specify some assumptions, theoretical assumptions about the underlying shapes of the probabilities for, for the variables that we're putting in and randomizing in order to generate this sort of more elaborately.
Right.
So,
this stuff is generated, right, by expert opinion. Right, so the nice model is the experts actually agree that these are the possibilities.
That's the worst of all possible.
Well, there's no way around that, right? There is no way around the fact that experts disagree. If experts agreed, we wouldn't have uncertainty, right? So experts disagree. I think the real disagreement here is not about the importance of some underlying normative view. It's about whether you can grapple with natural, stochastic randomness and expert disagreement using quantitative techniques or not.
right.
So
That's what it is.
I hate to interrupt, but it turns out that Admitted Students Weekend, our administrative law conference, and a criminal justice conference are the 100-year storm of law school schedule. So we have to leave this room at 3, but we should continue this discussion outside if you guys are all interested in sort of having a chat with each other.
But we should also have a formal thanking of the
Oh,
people that-
absolutely. I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially all of our presenters. It's an excellent conference, and I'm sure that it will result in a really wonderful set of papers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.